Welcome back to a big episode of the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 300. When I was planning this episode, I was like, I've got to set the Batman signal out. I've got to bring in some big guests, and I feel like we've delivered on this one. Tony Strudwick, Darcy Norman. How are we doing, guys? Tony, how are you?
Yeah, really good. Thanks, Ben. Delighted to be back on. Currently somewhere in the middle of England at St George's Park, so a fantastic facility, and we're well underway into pre-season. So yeah, all's really, really good, and looking forward to the next hour or so.
Top man. Darcy, how's things with you? It's been a bit of a busy period recently.
Yeah, kind of in recovery mode from the Copa with an unfortunate out in the group phase. But yeah, similar massive congrats on 300 episodes. Thanks for having Tony and I on, and look forward to the chat today.
Amazing. Yeah, in terms of topics, there was obviously so many different ways we could go. Two coaches with vast experience, vast knowledge, and worked with so many different teams and players. And you're just having a little chat about someone just before we started recording. I wanted to kick things off. Tony, I'm going to start with you. We've spoke about this a little bit before. Performance staff and their impact on culture, and whatever we mean by culture. I know you've spoken about that topic before as well, but if we're talking about impacting culture in different organizations, where does your mind go with that from a performance perspective?
Yeah, well, I think the exponential growth, and we've kind of touched on that before, the exponential growth of support staff and support services has obviously been evident, over the last decade, I say, in professional soccer. So I think it's something that's been growing and will continue to grow. The kind of impact on the grander culture of things is that, and I think this is critical to any success in any organisation, is that the performance staff have to be aligned both horizontally and vertically across the organisation. So what that means is it's not a standalone, Ben. What we've seen is that that the game is going into a direction, and we can kind of touch on that in a bit about the kind of future developments and where we feel the game is going. But the support services are critically important to continue to push the boundaries of human performance. I think the other thing is also to ensure that we have a duty of care for all of our players, particularly in the modern game with so many complexities and so on and so forth. But in the kind of the winning cultures, or in the winning organizations that I've had the pleasure to work with, certainly the performance services that have to have an identity. They have to have what I would call an impact, or create impact, particularly within the coaching process. So rather than being a standalone department, it has to be integrated fully across, whether it be the recruitment department, the coaching, the technical department, academy, and now obviously the women's side of the game as well. So yeah, really, really important. Sir Alex Ferguson once said that in his lifetime, sports science was one of the greatest kind of introductions, or the greatest movements that really pushed the game onto another level. And I think we've seen that modern day coaches have now been exposed to greater support systems, greater support models, more kind of links with universities, more kind of information and quality research that is embedded into practice. And what essentially that drives the game forward. It drives athletic pursuit forward. And I think that's what we're now kind of into that realm, Ben, of we don't have to kind of fight for an identity of of a performance department. It's there, it's evident. That the kind of next step is that how we integrate that, and how we really drive accountability across the organization, and really kind of add value to what we do, and the net result will be a continuation of the development of the game.
Darcy, what's your experience around that in terms of culture? Because you've been involved in, again, successful organizations. What's some of the traits that you see?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything Tony has said there. And I think, probably it just drives the importance building or emphasizing what he had mentioned on like clear communication, clear values, clear processes, on how people are operating, as Tony mentioned, vertically, horizontally. So you just have this seamless red thread through everything that's happening, that's all driving to performance and ultimately winning, because that, at the end of the day, we all know that's how we're being judged in sports. And so I think, technology is another big piece that is helping to enhance that. It's a little bit of a scary space in the sense, because it can, kind of draw the emphasis away from some of these really clear process progressions and the fundamental pieces that have gotten us to where we're at today. But that technology piece is a really good enhancement to that if used appropriately, and what's the word, efficiently, to drive the outcomes of what we're doing. I think the other big one, kind of around those clear processes and plans, and having clear mission, vision, values of all that stuff, is the mental models of these integrated teams, right? Because everyone's kind of coming at it from their own learning experience and understanding of how they've gotten to this place and then into a greater group, and taking the time to understand what does performance mean for me or for us or for this group or for that player, to make sure that everybody has just impeccable alignment on where things need to go and what needs to happen to get there.
Yeah.
What are some things that, when we're speaking to coaches, and especially coaches maybe a little bit earlier on in the career, when they're going into an organization and maybe the sort of identity has been presented to them, the values have been presented to them, the mission or the focus has been presented to them, what do those practitioners need to be aware of that's maybe going to be like a negative, or maybe isolate them away from the group? Because you've just talked about the importance of the like cohesive nature of a staff. We need to be involved together. What have been maybe some experience that you've had, Tony, of coaches that have acted in a certain way, or maybe done something that's maybe removed them away from that?
I think invariably it's about a clarity and a consistency of what we deliver, and I think that's really, really important. And given the kind of nature of the modern game, with the the transition of coaches, I mean, coaches don't always last. The shelf life of coaches within a certain team is, coaches come, coaches go, and so on and so forth. And what tends to happen is that performance staff is in place, and I think as long as there's a consistent approach and a clarity of what we do and what we represent, I think that is really, really strong. And of course, the more robust the model is, the more kind of immune to the pressure tests that come with it. So I'll give you an example. It's kind of, we've all been in situations where you've had an injury spike, or you've had a large number of injuries within a certain time frame, and it may not be that you've changed things considerably, although with a new coach, often the kind of training process changes, and that has kind of big implications for how players sort of adapt and break down and so on and so forth. But having a consistent approach in what we do, and I think that's really, really important, that the success of a performance service or its performance department will be there's one voice, and that's a consistent voice across the organization. So when new coaches come in and start to check and start to challenge, which you have, and then you will have, you'll be pressure tested at certain points in the year, that level of clarity has to be really, really strong. So and of course, you have to find a way of sense making, of making sense of certain situations. Why is this happening? Why are we kind of getting an increased number of injuries, or why is there underperformance across the board, and so on and so forth? But like Darcy said, data collection technology is a big part to what we do. So when we talk about accountability in how we deliver and what we deliver, I think we have got a lot of tools really that we can communicate with the head coach. And more than anything else, I believe in the impact of that service is, one is to obviously keep everybody fit and healthy, two, give everyone a voice, but number three is really aligned to what goes on and what's delivered on within the training process, and having that impact and kind of building that trust and rapport is really, really important, Ben. And I've been at clubs where I think I had 5 head coaches in just over 2 years. So making sure that we're very, very consistent in what we do and what we deliver and what we communicate, and not necessarily changing things just because a new head coach comes in with different training methodology. It's really, really critical that when we have this kind of, and I call it a sports science philosophy or a sports science methodology, is that's adaptable to any head coach, whether he wants to play in a high pressing format or whatever way he wants to train and play. I think our kind of success is born on the fact that we evolve over time. We have a really good understanding of situational dynamics of the team and how we work, and like Darcy said about different voices coming in. So being concrete and robust is really, really important, and that way, you future-proof your department against any eventuality or any kind of playing style or coach that comes through the door that you work with.
It's funny you should say that. We recorded a podcast yesterday that's gone out now as we speak with Luke Taylor, who's at Oxford United, and he sends his best to you, Tony, because I said we were recording tonight. And it was something that he spoke about, is sort of sticking by your guns, having your approach, sticking by your guns, having your way of working, obviously being adaptable because the different coaches have different ideas, but also having a process that you sort of built over time and trust. So what advice would you give to coaches when they're going through that? Because it's going to happen, isn't it, in football? You're going to experience different managers, even at the same. Yeah. What's your advice for coaches to sort of stick by the guns and have things set in place like Tony's just talked about?
Yeah, Tony touched on it. It's an interesting thing I came across that has really resonated with me is the trust piece. Like, the first thing in any relationship is garnering trust. And there is a book called The Trust Advisor that breaks out this formula on how to build trust. And it's credibility or capability, to what Tony mentioned of, here's our way of doing things, and having that credibility as a sports scientist or, a performance specialist, however you want to, give your title. The second factor, so it's credibility, capability, plus reliability, right? So day in, day out, you can trust that I'll be there, being consistent, driving the process, hitting home, then adding to that intimacy. And in this case, it's around dealing with struggles together, right? So every time you have to hit a hurdle, how are you walking through that? And then that kind of moves towards alignment on values, right? And are our values aligned? Because again, we've all had different coaches that can have very different values on what's important to them, and making sure, do my personal values align with their personal values, or what values do I have that I can attach to their values to find that trust and intimacy? And then that's divided by self-interest. And self-interest is like in our game is winning and being successful. And so we're there to win. We're there to help the coach win and do everything. And certainly we got to have our values that drive our decision making and how we do things. But that's been a really kind of good formula for me in kind of understanding that and driving, like, okay, these are the things that I'm going to stick to, and how it's going to impact. And then from there, it's just time. And again, those mental models of, when I say this, I really mean this, and it's not my definition of their term, it's their definition of their term. And then from there, it's just time and building that trust and consistency and growing that relationship.
I love that, because if coaches can look at that equation, they can probably point out the part that they need to focus on and improve on 100%. As well. Because you've just talked about credibility. So that's going to come, like you mentioned, with time, with results, with probably testing things out and building up experiences at different levels. Essentially, everyone could be reliable, couldn't they? But I know there are some people that aren't necessarily. So is it just a case of looking at that from your perspective and going, right, where are the areas you need to improve? Are you ticking those boxes?
Yeah. Yeah. Like for me, the reliability is just showing up like, hey, I'm going to be there at 7 o'clock every day. And here's my routines and the things that will consistently happen day in, day out, getting that information. I think the credibility capability is just your personal self-education, right? Of improving yourself day to day, improving your knowledge base in the industry that we're doing, being a good planner and being able to organize information and get all that stuff together in a concise way that they can use that information. And then the intimacy piece is just those daily struggles of, oh, how do you want that information? Do you want it this way or do you want it that way? What bit resonates with you solving that problem, whether it's with the coach, the player group, whatever the case may be. And then the self-interest, as I mentioned, is winning and being successful. And you have to be a contributor. Like I always say, there's energy givers and energy takers, and you want to be an energy giver because there's so much in the world that's taking away the energy. Like we were talking earlier about the media, it just sucks the life out of you. And you got to have people that want to contribute and give and not be takers.
100%. Tony, just on a point that Darcy just mentioned there in terms of how you present, whether it's data, whether it's performance in the gym, on the pitch, to players, to staff, just to give people an idea, how much variation have you found from practitioner to practitioner to player to player? Are people very different with how they want that information received?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've spoken about it before. I mean, you work with some kind of coaches, head coaches that are very much data driven, that really demand a daily reporting structure and a really kind of drill down into the different elements of what you're looking for. And that's kind of they're on a continuum, right? You've got the kind of really data driven or I would say coaches who fundamentally make up, a lot of their decision-making processes are geared around data and numbers and so on and so forth. And that's one end of the continuum. And then on the other end of the continuum, you've got the kind of intuitive, fearly based coaches that believe in coaching with the eye and so on and so forth. I think the kind of perfect formula is to find a way to connect and build trust, like Darcy said earlier, but also find a way to, how am I going to influence the head coach? And it's the same thing with the modern day player. And we have to give I think sports science and strength and conditioning and all the kind of services that come around it a lot of credit for the work that's been done over the last 2 decades, because the modern day footballer understands numbers. The modern day footballer understands key metrics. They understand, the key stakeholders we're working with. They've got a good grasp of technology and understanding and so on and so forth. So our job really is to, without kind of having a one size fits all approach that this is how we do it. It's kind of it's kind of influencing change and finding ways to impact and influence. And I think that's really, really important. I mean, I've used the kind of analogy before that, when I first went into Manchester United with Alex Ferguson 15, 20 years ago, I put a pre-season report on his desk, and it was still there 6 months later. It hadn't been touched. Now, finding a way to communicate with him is that it was a very, very kind of fast-paced environment, and you pretty much had, you had to manage him like a 1-minute manager. You had to get the facts across. You had to be, you had to have three key things that you really wanted to hit him with. Anything beyond that, you're working with head coaches that in the modern game have got, a huge volume of noise in the background, whether it be, like you said, the press before, team selection, and so on and so forth. So, bogging that particular coach or head coach down with numbers and stats, that just wouldn't land. And that was a real key kind of learning experience for me, Ben, in that, find a way to manage the manager, find a way to manage certain players, connect with them on a human level, but also, find ways to really engage with them and drive them on. And, I think that comes with, and I'm sure Darcy's got, abundance of it, that comes with what I call conventional wisdom or craft knowledge about understanding, what practitioners, what floats them, and how you can influence them. And that's really, for me, that is a really, really big part of it. And the tools we use, whether it be technology or, or basic, human contact. And we've spoken about, just having just having that kind of soft touch, or that soft approach today, really to connect and get your message across. So yeah, that comes from wisdom. And for the young practitioners that are out there, is kind of, over time evolve a way of doing things where you are flexible, you're adaptable, but you kind of you find a way to, contract and work with players and staff.
Darcy, how have you found that in terms of the differences?
Yeah, I think Tony hit it on the managing the manager. In my head, what popped into my head as you asked this and Tony was chatting is around managing expectations, right? Like, you got to manage up, you got to manage down, you got to manage laterally. And so, in order to do that, you have to be a great listener, and you have to hear the conversations that are going on, and the conversations and the statements that the manager's making or the coaches are making. And then, that gives you information to their mental model of what's tickling their brain, and what are the things that they're thinking about. And then, as you're giving a report, just say, hey, coach, I noticed yesterday you mentioned that you thought this was happening. And so I hopped back in, I looked at a few things, and exactly what you said was happening. And here's the pieces that related to why that was happening. As just as an example. And then they're like, oh yeah, that's great. And any time, again, you can build that trust. And it sounds like I'm giving them a little confirmation bias, but you start relating that information to what they're seeing, and they may be seeing it and making a statement, but for the wrong reasons. And so you can kind of clarify those bits to, again, make sure everybody's mental model is driven to the right place, or the most accurate place. And and then building on that. So I think that's the big one for me, is Tony alluded to, is the managing expectations, and being a good listener around what the needs that they need in that moment, in that day, trying to anticipate, to again, what Tony said around conventional wisdom. What's coming. Like, you're going to have a string of tight games, and you're going to have a string of things happening within your schedule. And so what can you anticipate coming up and happening that you can already have in your bag to almost bring it up before it becomes an issue or becomes a topic?
Yeah, definitely. I want to pull from both of your experiences now, because we spoke about the younger practitioner, and a lot of people look at yourselves and want to be in positions that you guys have held and currently hold as well. So they might be in starting out positions, they might be in teams that we've kind of talked about, and the importance of that cohesiveness of that team. But directors of performance, head of performance, these roles, Darcy, what are some of the differences in terms of the traits, the attributes that you've got to develop? Because you're now leading, you're having a team of people that you're responsible for. We've talked about the chats that you're having with managers. I'm sure there's other people, other stakeholders that you're now having conversations with. What are some key things that you'd advise people that this is where you need to spend your time and develop?
Yeah, I'll probably divide this into two buckets. So the first bucket, I'm going to sound like your granddad about the story about being uphill both ways to school in 4 feet of snow. I think back in the day when Tony and I got started, it was, you had a stopwatch, a tape measure, sets, reps, distance. You had very few data points, and that was what got you going. And then it was really about your planning and your progressions and the steps that you took to get there, and your ability to do that. Then with the onslaught of data, it's almost that we forgot about that part, and it's just about the numbers. And you're like, well, okay, well, where does these numbers sit in your planning and your progressions and your periodization? And I feel like the younger groups these days are so focused on data because that's where the sexy part is, or at least in today's day and age, that they're forgetting about the planning, the periodization, and the programming, and having really good systems and processes. Because again, back in the day, especially with a rehab background, if I knew if I skipped a step, it would come back and bite me. And so it was really about having good checklists and systems to make sure that I could repeatedly get where I wanted to every time, and then refining those. And then the data points were just checkpoints along the way to make sure I stayed on track. And now we have so many data points, it's almost, you get lost and you're like, and people ask like, what should I test? What should I look at? And it's like, well, what are you doing first? Then find the information to give you what you need to answer the questions to improve your systems. So I would say that's a big piece of advice, is really stick to that, the planning, periodization, progressions, and then find the data bits and the technology to support or confront your biases to make your systems and structures better. And as far as from I guess developing through in the positions that I've held over time, some of the pieces that are key, I think, to trying to be successful, which are very similar to coaches. I think you have to be a good planner, right? We just talked about anticipating needs and being ahead of the game, so that when you get to these confrontational positions, you've already thought through 99% of what could possibly happen, so you can really spend the quality of time needed in that short moment to make the best decision possible. Communication, obviously, as we just have been talking about. I think empathy, listening, hearing, communicating, that developing trust, understanding those pieces, general just management skills. Where do people want to go, and understanding what their needs are? Because I may have a need for that person in our staff, but they might have a different need of where they want to go. And, and I'm just a stop in their journey to their destination. And so trying to find that balance of, where we're mutually beneficial to each other to get where we want to go. And I think, around the planning piece, it is, being really clear in what the mission, vision, and values are of what you're trying to accomplish, and to be able to communicate that effectively to the group. And then decide, again, do our values align? Because it might not be that, and I've had to let people go, and it's really because just our values weren't the same. And that's not a bad thing. It is what it is thing. Like, this is black, that's white, and they're not the same. And you like white, I like black, and we're going for black, and that's it. You got to find somebody that's going for white, and being able to deal with that and have difficult conversations, to because they're going to happen, and you got to be ready for them.
Yeah.
Tony, what have you got on that?
Yeah, I'll probably start where Darcy started, actually. And again, I agree everything that Darcy said there. I kind of use that, when I was growing up, granddad type thing, if you wanted to kind of learn and you wanted to kind of know about a topic or a subject, you had to go to the local library, right? And you had to find a book, and you had to do your research, and it took a long time to get there. I think the modern generation, and I have young children as well, right, that everything's right in front of them. So I think first, and for a modern day practitioner, one is that it takes time, and there's not kind of a quick trajectory to get from going in as a sports scientist to ending up as a head of performance and a performance director, because I think that process takes 20 plus years. I speak to young practitioners, and they're kind of 5 years in the game, and they're telling me that they're ready for the next role after being in professional sport for 4 or 5 years as a head of performance, and I don't get that, and the reason I don't get that is because when I first started, and when kind of sports science was in its infancy, and there was a lot more kind of emphasis on, we didn't quite know where sports science was going to take us. We knew that it would add value. We knew that, or we understood what physiology and the basic physiological principles of of the game of football and soccer, as called in America, what it represents. But kind of that experiential learning back then is kind of like Darcy said, is you're relying on, think, feel, experience, intuition, and so on and so forth. And there's no kind of substitute in my mind for experiential learning, in that you have to go through all them kind of steps to get to where you want to get to. I think when we kind of we get to being in the game 20, 30 years, working across professional sport for 3 or 4 decades, it's kind of I've just made 4 notes here. Is that what do I think is really, really important for a head of performance or performance director? One, the ability, managing up and down with equal confidence. So that's to your team and to the manager and or the chief exec. 2 is to be respected by your peers and the athletes you work with, and that kind of comes back to what Darcy spoke about in terms of consistency and reliability. I think the third and probably the most important thing when you're a performance director or head of performance is the ability to make decisions that directly impact on performance. And I think that will then flip back down to people will respect you when you have the ability to make them decisions. And as Darcy would know, working at in kind of an international level and, big organization, US soccer and so on and so forth, is that every day it's a fast-paced environment. Every day, Darcy will have to make, quick decisions that impact on performance. Every day the kind of is going to be pressure tested into, making how long can this player play for? When is this player ready to start? All these big things, and you can't get that from a data spreadsheet alone. And we can come on to that kind of the modern day approach and so on and so forth. So kind of, the advent of technology and GPS and performance tracking and so on and so forth has been a huge step in the right direction. We can now kind of look at numbers and build it back into the picture. But sometimes we have to reverse engineer that. And, I kind of sometimes thinking, driving home, what would happen if everything shut down and you had to go back to what it was? And the ability to turn up somewhere. Darcy might take his US national team, to another country, and all of a sudden, Wi-Fi is down. Like, shit, what happens then? He said, well, okay, no, you have to have that kind of robust enough approach to be able to deal with it. I've seen the kind of, how the US guys work, and I must say during the last World Cup in Qatar, their training base was world class. But what happens if you turn up to somewhere and all of a sudden things aren't in place, or you can't ship certain things out for, then you have to work on the fly. And I think the kind of when we're so focused on making decisions through data, and that's our only way of kind of seeing the world, it leads to us to a kind of reductionist approach, that we have all the answers. They're all on the spreadsheet and so on and so forth. But sometimes we have to kind of remove ourselves from that and go, well, okay, let's go back. Let's kind of assimilate the data with our own kind of conventional wisdom and come towards performance solutions, because that's what we're here for, right? We're here for performance solutions. And what high performance sport is about winning. It's about sustained winning, which is very different from developmental football. So having that diverse kind of background and consider yourself as a practitioner as a kind of a round table, and the more legs you've got underneath that, rather than just data decision or data driven decision making, the more legs you've got, the more robust you are in any eventuality. And I think that is really fundamental, in a young practitioner's development, and I think we do live in a fast generation. A generation expects quick results, but I think in terms of different experiences, I must say, the role I'm in now, I've probably learned as much in the last 2 years as I did the previous 6 or 7, because it's new things I have to deal with. You're having to deal with staff, which is very, very different. All the kind of, the competing things that go in managing staff and managing different egos and managing different personalities along the way. That's a different skill set to delivering and managing on the field or in the gym, and and so on and so forth. So what we're looking at is kind of the different skill set. The modern day skill set to be a head of performance is not a kind of an S&C or a fitness coach that's done 4 or 5 years in a role and then goes into into an organization as head of performance because, you know, the head coach takes him there. It's kind of, there are different skill sets around what needs to be done to be a modern day performance director. And again, that's my kind of opinion.
Relating that to a player, Tony, this is where we can look at maybe player to manager to say, right, we've got this world-class player or this elite level player. They're not necessarily going to make an elite level manager. Is that kind of what we've got to look at? And is the people more suited to be in that role where they maybe are a little bit more hands-on? They're having less of these bigger decisions to make, less of these maybe confrontational discussions that Darcy talked about before when someone's maybe questioning something. Do you think there's practitioners more suited to one than the other, or do you think everyone can develop into that and develop those skills? It just takes time.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to the player analogy, I think there are two different things in terms of football knowledge. One is in-game knowledge, so that's the ability for a player to make decisions in the game, and you know the other kind of knowledge is knowledge of the game. So we've had a load of fantastic coaches that not necessarily played at the highest level that have gone on, and it's very, very different. It's two very, you know, separate things, and that's what I'm talking about. Is that, you know, just delivering with players and in that kind of skill set is very different to managing people, and probably, you know, that's been my evolution, and it'd be good to get Darcy's take on that. In kind of where my learning has been in the last kind of 5 to 10 years is more around, you know, building processes and accountability and how to manage staff, how to manage a support service team, which is very different to kind of delivery. And probably I spent, you know, a lot of years kind of at the delivery end of the spectrum. Probably too much, because that's the kind of stuff that I enjoyed. That's the kind of sexy stuff. But the real learning comes from stepping back and kind of, you know, stepping back from the process sometimes and going, right, okay, I need process in place. I need to align the services. I need to align the vision, as Darcy said. Yeah, and I need to create something that's incredibly robust to withstand any eventuality.
Darcy, what's your opinion on that in terms of whether coaches can all be suited to that sort of role, or whether it just suits certain people?
Well, I think, you know, when you use the word suited, it's like, what skills do I have at this moment that suits your need, right? And no different than if we take the player analogy, you have a player that has certain traits and certain, you know, might be tall, small, lower center mass, whatever, that makes a certain set of skills easier for them to demonstrate out on the field. Does it mean that they can't do other stuff? No, not at all. And can you develop those skills? Absolutely. You know, but based on your upbringing and all the people that you've interacted with in your life, you may, you know, be more suited to your word, to these particular things. And I've worked with people that became performance directors, that they got there and they're like, this position is not for me. I just don't enjoy it because it, you know, it takes away from these other bits that I really enjoy. And they actually stepped down and went back into the space that you know, that brought them joy. And they didn't really want to develop the skills necessary to continue to move forward. And that's totally okay, right? It just depends what's important to you and what brings you joy and happiness and doing the things that you want to do. So can they be developed? Absolutely. Do some skills and traits are harder to develop for some people? Absolutely. Like I get in my processes of going, and sometimes I forget to bring people with me, or I forget to listen and really understand what they're asking for. So those, you know, like empathy for me is something that I really have to work on to get better. And I know it, right? Like I know that that's something that I need to work on. So I try and take time to work on that and be aware of where my downfalls are. And so, yeah, so I think it's all developable. But it also goes with, you know, what do you want to do? What brings you happiness? What, you know, what's your motivation behind where you want to get to? I think are the, you know, kind of some of the key elements.
talking there on just that reflective nature of your practice, you spoke about an area that you know that you've got to work on and develop. Do you have a specific way of going through that reflection? Or is it just a case of spending a little bit of time and thinking, actually, I could have maybe dealt with that scenario a little bit better or in a different way? Or do you have anything specific that you do?
Yeah, so that's something that I've developed over time. Is I've started to do a lot of journaling. So kind of taking reflections in the morning, in the evening, trying to take notes on why I do what I do, and, putting things together, and then the other one is finding people that I admire in those traits and trying to study them, of, what is it that they do day in, day out, like taking time to just ask people, how are you doing? How are things? Slowing down, and just seeing, finding examples of what is impressive to me about good quality coaches or directors or people in general, and then trying to emulate those practices, or even understand, like, why do I admire that person or their qualities so much? What are they doing that makes, that draws me to that? And then, kind of evaluating myself and what I do, and then trying to, implement those pieces and get feedback and iterate, as Tony said, like, just trying to live through the process to get better at it.
Tony, what's your sort of process around that? Do you have one? Or
Yeah, I mean, kind of, I think if you want to kind of sort of develop and move into these kind of spaces that a lot of young practitioners want to move into, reflective practice is a big thing, and how you do that. Darcy said journaling, making notes, kind of. I've started to kind of look at what we call process mapping, in that kind of when you break the season down, is kind of really register certain events, and that the great thing about elite sport, right, is that, if you record everything and everything's observable, then, all these events have occurred before. So, capturing that and looking at critical periods throughout the season, and kind of process mapping that across, what happens in pre-season, players come back in, you kind of, the learnings really are kind of, taking notes on what happened at that particular point of the season, and what happens, in our transfer window towards the back end of that, and making notes, and kind of prepping yourself for, season on season, because, most events have occurred on this curve before. So that's really, really important, I think. The other thing really about kind of learning, and my kind of leadership and management style is more kind of authentic, in that there's always a level of transparency. So, I think to develop that and to be a leader is that you've got to be open and transparent, and if you're going to check and challenge, you've got to be prepared to have that back. So 360-degree feedback, and finding moments to do that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in a very formal way, but in informal ways. That, I think the one of the great things that I like about my team at West Bromwich Albion is that we're kind of open, we're honest, and we check and challenge. And, to do that, and to go into an organization, if Darcy and myself went into an organization, it's kind of, yes, you've got to build trust to do that, and you've also got to build safety to be able to do that. And what I don't mean comfort, where people are in a comfort zone. I mean safety. You create an environment where it's safe to check and challenge. It's safe to me to say to Darcy, why is this injury broken down? Should we have done this better? Should we have done that better? And so on and so forth. And I think once you strip that and create safety for people to, to move away from a blame culture, because we've all been there, right? You're in a situation where, you have a spike in injuries, and the kind of the medical department, are blaming the sports, or the physiotherapists are blaming the sports scientists. The sports scientists are blaming the coach is blaming the medic, and so on and so forth. And that's not a way to operate or to be successful, in my opinion. So having that open, honest feedback, and creating a no blame culture where give everyone a voice, because, fundamentally it's about keeping, everybody fit and healthy. It's about developing, people and practitioners and players. And I think that's really, really important, to give everybody a voice. And, how you do that is very, very important. And like Darcy says, is that, you've got to allow people to talk, other members of staff have got to be respectful and listen, and we've got to be prepared to check and challenge. And I think that's one of the ways that, in terms of me developing, it's kind of, 25 years ago, you're very independent. Darcy was probably filling drinks bottles up, and he was making shakes, and he was planning training, and he was delivering everything. In the modern way of doing things, it's kind of, we're a team, and there are complexities in a team. And the more kind of complexities within a team is the more, the increased dynamics, and you've got to manage that. And you have to manage that by being open, giving everybody a voice, but also at times as a leader, saying, okay, this is how we're going to do it. I hear what you're saying, but this is how we're going to do it. And that comes from trust. And that comes from, really having that transparency with your staff and the people you work with.
It's funny you say that, Tony, because I always use this example, right? It's basically a football team. You got 11 people on the pitch with the objective of putting a ball in the net, and everyone is a quarterback, everyone is in offense, everyone is in defense, everyone is transitioning. And, so they have their roles, but they also, there's going to be a time where they're going to have to pick up somebody's role and, support to get that there. And, and it's up to the coach that comes in and says, okay, here's our group. This is how we're going to play. This is how we're going to try and hit our objective of getting the ball in the net. And it's really no different in a performance team. It's the same. You got a bunch of players that have a bunch of talents, and it's up to, the performance director to, figure out what those talents are, get them in a way that, gets the ball in the net and hits all the objectives. And then, also being able to give feedback of, hey, this is why you're in this role, and you're not ready to do this yet because we need these qualities, or you need to improve on these skills. And so it is, as Tony mentioned, it's knowledge of the game and then knowledge in the game, and building that. So it's really analogous to football itself in that process.
I agree. Good point.
Makes sense. Tony, you just spoke about how things have developed in your roles, from filling water bottles and being the only sort of staff member within that team, and how things have developed. It's a topic we've spoke about quite a bit before, in terms of looking ahead 5 years, 10 years down the line, how the game will potentially change. Just starting on that, in terms of the demands put on players, what's your thoughts in terms of how things do they need to change? Like, what do we need to change in terms of our approach with players?
I mean, listen, I think on the last podcast and some of the presentations that I've done recently, I've kind of spoke about a kind of an injury paradox that, sports science models and kind of performance support teams are expanding, but we're still kind of getting, injuries are still on the rise, or particular injuries on the rise. And I'll come back to that. I think what we saw in the Premier League last year was definitely, probably for me, a pinch point or a critical turning point, where there were a lot of injuries, and kind of, it wasn't necessarily the number of injuries, it's a kind of burden of injuries. And I'd like to hear Darcy's opinion on this as well. Is that, 10, 15 years ago, we had hamstring injuries, we had soft tissue muscle injuries, of course we did, but the kind of what anecdotally that I'm witnessing at the moment is that, when an athlete breaks now, it's not just a kind of, whatever classification system use, a 1A or a 2B, we're kind of having tendon involvement. So in my mind, where I'm trying to equate this is that what we're kind of doing, and with the reliance on metrics and practitioners pushing certain kind of, or chasing numbers, I call it, right? You got to hit zone 5 and zone 6. What I've kind of seen anecdotally over the kind of last couple of years is that it's the high intensity actions of the game, and it's the nature of training, it's the nature of the high pressing actions during a game. And it's not necessarily the nature of that, it's a kind of the density of the actions. So we are putting muscle and tendon under huge stress. Obviously sports science has kind of done its role in pushing the boundaries of human performance. And, my athletes come back now, or, athletes come back into pre-season much better, so much better now than they were 10, 15 years ago. And kind of some of that is kind of, increased sports science knowledge and understanding. Some of it is that a lot of our athletes are working with external practitioners away from the club. So it's not a kind of, it's no longer a season, an annual season where there's an off-season period. And that's something that needs to be addressed. I don't know how they get around it in the US with other sports, but I would like to see an enforced rest period where athletes rest, and ultimately the game's getting quicker, and ultimately the training process has changed. What we're seeing are more high-end accelerations and decelerations and kind of explosive actions. So we're getting it in the game, we're getting it in the training process. Well, guess what? It's kind of, something's got to give along the way. That's a given. I think the other thing is that if we rely on the traditional variables of kind of GPS metrics or distance covered, zone 5, high intensity, sprint distance, and so on and so forth, and we ignore this bit, the high intensity actions, we're still pushing the traditional variables, but we're not accounting for this. And again, I liken it to kind of, there's only so much red wine that can flow into a cup. If we're doing, the distance covered, the zone 5, the zone 6, and all these kind of actions that come with it, and the technical load that, we always say that, not everything, measurable is worthwhile and so on and so forth. But it's kind of this technical load, in my opinion, is getting higher and higher. So we're asking more of the athletes. So I think what needs to happen is we really need to drill down into, what the mechanics of the modern day training session looks like, the complexity of that. 25 years ago, there were probably 3 or 4 parts to a training session. It was a warm up. There were passing drills. There was kind of game based or small sided games, and then maybe some activities at the end. Boom. Now we're seeing 8, 9, 10 parts of a session. Increased complexity of the session, and kind of the density of the technical loads and these high explosive actions within a short period of time, is far greater than what you'd experience during a game. So I think that's something we need to look at. I think we need to have a level of governance around what some of our athletes are doing away from our sporting clubs. I mean, I've spoken about that, and don't get me wrong, there was some excellent models that are in place that that are looking at this service around the player outside of the club and so on and so forth. But one, it needs legislation, it needs a level of governance, and it needs a level of transparency, and within that is kind of when our athletes are working externally, is that we have to have a level of duty of care and data protection around what they're doing. So they're the kind of things I'm looking at in the future. We spoke about the external practitioner 5, 10 years ago, and it's here. We have to deal with it, and there are ways to deal with that. I think the next generation will be really, and then again, get Darcy's take on this, because sort of like the injuries and this, is that what will be the influence of artificial intelligence and AI? Is it going to be a case that we look at injuries and we look at kind of rehabilitation programs, when we've got enough information within a system, an athlete breaks down and we can kind of all of a sudden it will spit out a program that an athlete can follow from a hamstring injury back into return to play and so on and so forth. So the kind of the futuristic capabilities in where we can go with information and what we can use and the smart stuff, I think that's interesting on the one hand and scary on the other, like Darcy said earlier on. So, what impact will that have? Will we ever go towards automated decision making? That worries me, that concerns me. Being a bit of a dinosaur myself, that kind of, getting a blend right between the two. But I think these are kind of the nuts that really, when we're kind of future proof and future scope where the industry is going, we certainly need to arrest the number of injuries we're getting, and we certainly need to think about where this kind of technology space is going to shoot off onto.
I think with that sort of automated approach, you've talked about that in the podcast so far, haven't you? And that importance of the person and all the skills that come with that side of things anyway. So I think that that sort of defines the reason behind that. Darcy, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a deep question. Tony hit on a lot of pieces and it kind of got my hair on fire. I think it is a complex system, right? And it's an ever-changing system, which makes it really difficult. Like there's that, I don't know if it's an Einstein quote, I think, about, the same, what is it? Something around the problems that got us here are not the same solutions that are going to move us away from these problems, right? And a system is only good as the results of that system. So if you don't like the results, you got to change the system, because the system will produce the right results. And if those results aren't for the needs of what you want at that moment, then you got to change the system. And I think, all these systems get put in place from developing as a kid all the way through of the professional demands. And I think there's a much bigger need in the qualities, and you're actually seeing it, right? Like this next generation of player, how fast, explosive, to everything Tony said, like how much they can go. And now also it's a big commercial space. And so, hey, to make more money, we need to play more games. And so that's another complexity that gets added onto it. And it's not a one-to-one relationship by any stretch. And so, I don't think there is a one-word answer or a one-thing answer to all this. And I think from a technology side, we've gotten a lot more information to build better systems and to really understand what's happening and to program more concretely and effectively. But I also think we have a long way to go. Like how we measure decelerations, for instance, it needs a long way to go. How we started was somebody, I don't even know the history, but it'd be interesting, right? Like kind of like the width of automobile tires came from wagons, which came from this. And somebody said, hey, we're going to look at XLs and decels and we're going to class them at negative and plus 3 meters per second squared. And that's how we're going to measure. And, and who knows why they picked that measure, but then that just fell into a standard that everybody uses. And, deceleration has a much bigger effect on the body than accelerations. And, you can only accelerate to 6, 7 meters per second squared, but you could decelerate to 9, 10, 12 meters per second squared. And then you have that eccentric load. So when you think about, I think the getting up to speed is doesn't have near the impact as the stopping. So if you're a player that is now running at 10 meters per second and you have to stop in a meter or two and change directions, the force that you have to overcome to tolerate that, and that's just one incident over time. And I think we need a lot more work on classifying deceleration. I think one thing, and this is the battle in football, like I didn't come from football, and so it was one of the big things that I learned in coming in. It's a very heavy technical sport because you play it with your feet. And so you spend a lot of time on the technical aspects and the decision making and all that kind of stuff, which is absolutely correct. But what gets missed is the strength and conditioning side of it. And I think that's where we have a lot of opportunity, is the relative strength and improving the relative strength of the players. Because if you just think about it, if I'm pound for pound as strong as possible, right? Like my relative strength is higher, I have less fatigue to do the same amount of work. So if I have less fatigue to do the same amount of work, I've instantly gotten fitter, right? Because the metabolic cost to do that work goes down. So now I don't have as high a metabolic demand. And if that work is easier, the accumulation is less. So I can recover faster because now the amount of work I've done relative to my system is less. And it's like anything, right? Like you do something once and it's like, oh, that was stressful. That was really hard. You do it again. Oh, I'm getting a little more efficient at it. I'm getting better at it, right? And there's the actual work it takes, the energy it takes, and then there's the efficiency to do it. And those two pieces, are I think the critical piece, and that defines power. Work divided by time. I can just get efficient at something and I'm more powerful, or I can, get relatively stronger so that work piece has less impact on my system. And those are the two things. And I think in football, That's a big one, is that relative strength, but it takes away from the technical aspects and the culture of where football came from. And I think, that's where you're going to see. And it's not, when I always say relative strength, because I don't want people to think like, oh, I'm going to be big and bulky and can't move. Well, it's all got to be relatable to the sport. But guys, I don't think they really appreciate how strong they can get. And I think that's a big one. And I'll probably get a lot of shit for saying this, but like, that's where CrossFit is really interesting. And I'm not comparing a CrossFitter to a footballer, but they've shown with CrossFit, the elite people and how they're training, that I can squat a ton of weight and I can still go out and run a 5-minute mile or a 6-minute mile. And I can do all these different things. So they've shown the capacity of our human ability is really high in a lot of different ways. And I think we can learn from that and apply it in the football space. And so for me, that's a big one where our efforts are focused on, is really just educating these guys. And again, the technology now with 1080 sprint, with output sports, with velocity based training, you can take, and GPS, you can start to relate and say, hey, here's the math that's happening on the field, physics. And you can start to backtrack and translate that in a very clean way to, the weight room or the performance room or whatever you want to say.
It's also why it's a super exciting time, though, isn't it? Because this is really impactful in terms of performance questions. These are things that are going to be put towards us. So it's a really exciting time, isn't it, Tony?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's an exciting time that, I've kind of, the space we're in now for, for young practitioners coming into it is, there's so much high quality content available to kind of, to get an understanding of the, the physical principles of what we do. So it's out there. It's kind of, there's a hunger and a thirst for learning and development and so on and so forth. I think when we've seen the integration of different coaching methodologies that certainly I've experienced, and the Premier League have experienced over the last decade or so, has been really, really refreshing. And like kind of coming on to Darcy's point about kind of efficiency, whether it be movement efficiency or whether it be, and what that looks like, going forward, it comes back down to a high performance principle and about creating an efficient product. And if the number of games are going to be at around 50, 60 for some of that, 60 games a season from our best players, the real kind of performance advantages you're going to get over competitors is that how you are efficient, how you train your players, how you recover your players, how you rotate your players, having kind of the art and science of managing a squad and managing through the season. And I think that's where, we're all looking to get a competitive advantage. Of course we do, and that's what high performance sports about. But, where it's going now is kind of, it is an exciting space, but let's not lose sight of, what the basic fundamentals are, which is really one is to do no harm to the athlete. One is to protect the athlete, and the second bit around that is making sure we maximize what the athlete can do, and that's just what Darcy said there. So yeah, it is exciting times, and that's kind of why we're still in it. We still love it. We're still kind of trying to push the boundaries of our own kind of development and the game itself. So yeah, I'm still quite excited for what the future holds.
As I think we could talk about this as a topic probably all night, but I really appreciate, I've just checked the clock. I can't believe an hour's flown by already. So I'm going to sort of bring things to a close there, but I really appreciate, I think those sorts of conversations will relate to a lot of people, and they're obviously going to become even more evident over the next few years as well. And with the whatever changes are going to be made within the game as well, that who knows over the next few seasons. In terms of just final thoughts, Tony, is there anything for you just to wrap things up?
I think kind of what I just said just now is that in our pursuit for the kind of this tip of the arrow and construction and building, whether it be a process or the kind of the efficient athlete, it's just being mindful of, in essence, is that we still have a duty of care to ensure that all our processes and systems are in place are really there to safeguard the athletes. And I think, we're moving into a space now where injuries or incidents of injuries, burden of injuries are big news. It's big news. It's big business. It's costing, for players to be out of, not being able to participate and be injured. It's a multi-million-dollar sport. So I think that's something that I would really like to see us, from a research perspective, from an organization perspective, from a governance perspective, is to really drill down, and somebody's really got to take a lead on this. Otherwise, where we're going to be and what we really want, and Darcy I'm sure will agree with this, we want our best athletes playing. We want our best skill performers on the field. And I think that's really important, that our job penultimately is to build systems and processes to allow the best players to perform week in, week out.
Darcy, anything from you just to wrap things up?
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the biggest things, kind of we touched on it a few times around technology, and we also said these processes and getting those operating. I think the people that really understand and get their processes around data and information systems is also going to be a massive advantage, because it's hard. It's really hard. And it's hard to do it consistently and cleanly to get you the information that really is meaningful. Because sometimes, you can measure one thing, get a piece of information, but sometimes you got to measure it 50,000 times to understand these other trends and things. And if your information and information systems aren't consistent, you're never going to get there. And the people that are taking the time and energy to deal with that now, I think, are going to have a massive advantage in the future, because they'll have worked through a lot of the problems of, just even cutting your GPS. What am I going to name this? What variables are going to be in the name that I can start to research and understand to get more and accurate information out of those bits. So yeah, I think I'm just as excited today as I was when I started in this, of all the possibilities and where the potential of all this can go. And I totally agree with Tony, and it's all for the health and well-being of the people that are participating in it. And the players physically, but also on the mental side, as we talked about earlier before the podcast, of the criticisms and all the media stuff, and the Twitterverse and all the stuff that goes on there. It's I think, we just got to continue to get smarter and lean on each other for information sharing and so forth. So I think that's where this stuff is great, and really appreciate being on with Tony and you having us on, and I think the future is bright.
I feel very privileged to be part of the conversation, listening to you both. So I really appreciate you both coming on and how openly you spoke as well. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks,
Thanks,
Daz.
fellas. Yeah, good seeing you.
And you, buddy.